So in my presentation today, I'm going to walk you through what we can say is the state of the art on gender-based violence, focusing on three main aspects. The first one, gendering cyber violence. How do we conceptualize cyber violence from a gender perspective and why we have to do it? How can we frame it in relation to everything that we already know about gender-based violence? And why do we target it as a distinctive form of cyber violence, both in terms of quantity and quality of abusive interactions? What are the main aims and challenges of such a gender perspective on such a complex phenomenon? The second point is mapping of the current state of the art, what is actually being done, what are the instruments currently at our disposal in terms of definition, legislation, and policy at international, EU, and member state level. And then defining cyber violence, because one of the recurring terms today and also in the past couple of days is the importance of common definitions of the different forms. What are the challenges in reaching these definitions and what are the common components that can be identified? And in this part, I'm going to present the definitions that I contributed to developing at it.The when, as Marika said, I was project manager of the project on cyber violence against women and girls from 2021 to 2023. And I will try to show you why these definitions are important and what they bring to the table in order to advance data collection and evidence-based policy measures against cyber violence against women and girls. So the first part, and I would like to get a question out of the way, which is a question that I get all the time when I give this presentation or similar presentations to different audiences. And usually the question comes from men in the audience, what about men? I would like to make it very clear that cyber violence is not a form of violence that is exclusive to women. Men can be victims too. And women can be perpetrators, for example, of many forms of technology-facilitated control and psychological violence. And you may ask yourselves why we actually have and believe we need such a marked gender perspective on an issue that can, in principle, affect victims of all genders. Comparable data and statistics are still extremely scarce and diluted when it comes to digital instantiations of hate and discrimination. However, when these data is available, disaggregated data show that gender is a strong predictor of exposure to abuse on social networks. For example, 1 in 10 women in the EU has experienced harassment since the age of 15. And this is a FRA 2014 survey, and we have all reasons to believe that new data from the Eurostat FRA survey coming out this year in 2024, 10 years later, will show higher figures, given the growing embeddedness of digital media in our daily lives. This is something that has been mentioned quite a lot of times today, the General Recommendation number 1 by Grevio, and they point out that both men and women can experience incidents of interpersonal violence and abuse, including online, but women are considerably more likely to experience repeated and more severe forms of abuse, and as well as physical, psychological, and emotional consequences. And then another very important point to keep in mind is that these digital forms of cyber violence can be stronger towards lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women, as well as disabled women, women from racial and religious minority communities. This is a result from the FRA LGBT survey that shows that if gender and age, of course, they're strong predictors of exposure to abuse, so are sexual orientation and gender identity. Then there are some forms of cyber violence that target women almost exclusively, and they are related to the sexualization and the objectification of women that take place in our society. The sexual explicit portrayal, the dissemination of content without the consent of the victim, or receiving sexual explicit content and videos, viewing invitation or indecent messages, they're all forms of cyber violence that target women in a disproportionate, if not exclusive way. And then cyber violence plays an important role, in my opinion, in worsening problems that we already have, widening the digital gap, making female users unwelcome and in danger in the cybersphere, Gendered forms have a devastating impact on women's confidence when it comes to their access to development of the skills that they need, the use of digital technologies, the advancement of visible leadership and decision-making roles in the digital sector. And this only further contributes to the STEM ICT gender segregation and gender pay gap. This is also another concept that has been mentioned before. Why it is so important to talk about the continuum of violence when we talk about cyber violence. The digital and the physical are growingly enmeshed, and it is about time, 2024, that any remaining misconception of separation is to be abandoned. Unfortunately, it has proven very difficult to distinguish the forms and consequences of actions that are initiated online and the impact that they have on our lives and our societies. And one of the main challenges is that digital acts of violence more likely lead directly to physical harm, which is still regarded as one of the most visible and indisputable form of violence. In the late 1980s, Liz Kelly, a feminist scholar, a very important one in our field, in the field of GBV, proposed this concept of continuum of violence. And the concept was quite groundbreaking at the time, and I think it still is. She suggests that women's experience of sexual harm very often cannot be contained within the legal parameters that define sexual offense. Of course, when we think about GBV, we have to take into account different forms of non-reported, reported, convicted acts of harm. But also, she said something that was quite innovative, that women experience more than one form of violence at the same time, IPV, domestic, sexual, psychological, economical, to the point that it was almost impossible to tell one from another. Also, her research demonstrated that women can experience many acts of violence within what could be considered to be consensual relationships, often along a continuum. Why is this concept so important for us that want to study cyber violence? Because in 1988, of course, it was unimaginable that new forms of violence were to be found in a new continuum between what they're called online and offline spaces, which, by the way, are words that I really don't like. And I think we should abandon, because in 2024, I think that at least in some parts of the world, we are really never offline and we're always connected somehow. So I like to talk about the digital and physical spaces to kind of avoid this dichotomy between online and offline spaces. So sometimes violence starts in the physical world and continues thanks to the digital technologies as facilitators. Sometimes it starts in digital environments and kind of bleeds into the physical world, or it can take place in parallel. And I think that this concept of continuum of violence helps us to include and map different forms of abuse beyond the physical and to identify common gender-based ground between them. The dismissal of cyber violence as a minor problem usually revolves around three main myths and pitfalls that I've been trying to be debunked in my work and in my scholarship, and I'm sure you heard some of these before. The first one is just the internet, right? It's the internet fault. Social media have a very negative impact on human communication, and therefore cyber violence is to be regarded as an internet phenomenon rather than a social issue. What is my problem with this theory? When we communicate online, the feeling of anonymity that we have usually results in disinhibition. This is a theory that recalls Plato's myth of the ring of judges. The lack of face-to-face context, the difficulty we have in acknowledging each other's humanity online, it might play a role in the increase of aggressive impulses, together with the absence of contradicting and moderating voices, resulting in an exaggeration, a polarization of common divergences that always exist between opinion, vision, and segments of our society. All this is absolutely true, and all these factors definitely play a role. However, we have to keep in mind that as human beings, we have a very long and rich history of becoming acquainted with different media of communication. But the construction, the perception, and the communication of hate is primarily social. We have to be careful not to highlight exclusively the role played by social media as the medium, which I don't want to say it doesn't exist, but we should not be downplaying the existing socio-cultural, socio-political, socio-economic structures and the power hierarchies that are gendered in the world that is inhabited by the users of those internet platforms, which is our reality. The second tendency is that it's just for fun, right? The gamification of online violence, framing digital violence and harassment as episodes of hate play, recreational nastiness that are playful and rather than harmful because nobody's getting hurt at the end of the day. So this juvenile, goliardic, virtually harmless nature, this phenomena, the feeling around them has contributed to prevent framing them within a narrative of criminal aggression with social, material, and ethical relevance. This is also another point that has been highlighted, the ethical relevance. And I think this has played a role in the normalization of online violence as an integral act of digital citizenship. If you want to be online, you have to deal with it. The third point is, of course, that it's my right to say what I want to say. No, the libertarian free speech ethos on the internet, which too often results in an exculpatory narrative justifying cyber violence. Freedom of speech is a fundamental right, but the anxiety surrounding the fear of online censorship, I believe it has not helped the criminalization of cyber violence. Very often we see forms of abuse and hostility celebrated as a liberating anti-hegemonic act of free speech, a resistance to mainstream media norms and to political correctness without taking into account that our freedom of speech ends when the freedom of speech of another person begins, and together with the freedom of speech of the other person, the right to equality, dignity, and privacy, and all the other rights of the fundamental chart. So against all these myths and misconceptions about cyber violence, I feel that there is only one truth, that we have to deal with this form of violence as a form of gender-based violence, and this should be conceptualized, treated, and tackled as such, and also with an extreme urgency, because we see it proliferating and spreading and becoming viral every day. What are the main challenges in doing so? It is extremely complex. And first of all, I think that the first challenge is that there are many different forms. Many can be seen as online extensions of form of violence that are perpetrated in the physical world. Think about harassment and cyber harassment, stalking and cyber stalking. But we also need to acknowledge that the cyber element most likely amplifies the scale of violence and leads to different and unique impacts and harms compared to the violence perpetrated in the physical world. Then, of course, there are different tools, vehicles, platforms. If we think about the Internet of the Things, this is further expanded to include, for example, Stalkerware, which is a monitoring software used for cyber stalking. We've seen also in the presentations in the past couple of days how this is used in domestic violence, for example, even when the husband is not living at home anymore. There are different types of perpetrators. No, we have the ones, usually the usual suspects, right? In a gender-based violence context, the partner, the ex-partner, the relative, the acquaintance. But perpetrators in cyberspace can also be anonymous and unacquainted. And then, of course, it's an evolving environment, and the new technologies will inevitably give rise to different and new manifestations of online violence against women. And this is demonstrated, for example, with Stalkerware, but also the episodes of rape and abuse in the metaverse, also in the gaming sector. And then it's a cross-border and cross-cultural phenomenon. Social media allow, with their global networking affordances, allow spillover phenomena. Their new online communities formed across national borders with shared aims and interests. And sometimes this shared aim and interest is hating a specific social group. And sometimes this social group is women. An example is the emergence of the manosphere, and the incel community, which is part of the manosphere, international fora for the promotion and spread of misogyny and hostility, strong opposition to women's rights, and these groups have also been associated with xenophobic far-right and alt-right and terrorism. So it's always broader than that. Hate and discrimination are always somehow interconnected. Let's move to the second part of my presentation, where I would like to illustrate briefly the status quo and the instruments that we have, with a focus on EU and member state level. I believe that there is a strong prevalence, but also, unfortunately, we are facing some shortcomings in both the legal and policy framework, in data collection processes, even though there are recent developments that are very interesting and very promising. Let's start with the EU level before moving to the member state level. And let's start with the definitions, right? Because we said the definitions are so important. There is no harmonized legal definition of cyber violence against women and girls at the European level. There are several proposed definitions. The European Parliament has its own, Europol has its own, IGE has its own. There is a European Commission recommendation to use a definition by the Commission's Advisory Committee on Equal Opportunities for Women and Men from a couple of years ago. But we also have to keep in mind that cyber violence against women and girls is an umbrella term. And then we have all the different forms. And for all these different forms, cyber stalking, cyber harassment, non-consensual intimate image abuse, we also have other definitions. And sometimes they're not available, sometimes they're not comparable. When it comes to legislations, up until now, we haven't had no legal definition or dedicated instrument addressing cyber violence against women and girls. There are several established directives that, as we've seen in the last couple of days, that can apply directly or indirectly. Many of them have been mentioned before. The Victims' Rights Directive, very important. We had an in-depth session on that. The Directive on Combating Sexual Abuse of Children. The recast Directive on Equal Opportunity could also be applicable to some forms of cyber harassment, but it's only limited to matters of employment and occupation. There are some elements related to non-consensual sharing of intimate images also found in the GDPR, in the E-commerce Directive, in the Audio-Visual Media Services Directive, and somehow indirectly relevant to cyber violence, but given the strong gender and digital dimension of this issue, we have the Directive on Preventing and Combating Trafficking. A key element of the proposal to revise the anti-trafficking directive is referring explicitly to trafficking offences that are committed or facilitated by ICT means. And there is this need also to better equip national authorities to investigate and prosecute offences committed in whole or in part online. And I think that in the amendments also on the Victims' Rights Directive, there is an acknowledgement of the rise of online crimes in the past 10 years. So as we are revamping some of these instruments, we are also taking into account the fact that compared to 10 years ago, this has become a bigger problem. In addition, and these are the latest developments that are very interesting, in 2022, the Digital Services Act entered into force, and this updated the E-commerce Directive of 2000 regarding illegal and harmful content, transparent advertising, disinformation, among other aspects. The general idea is to create a safer digital space in which the fundamental users of all the fundamental rights of all users of digital services are protected. The same rights that you're entitled to in the physical world, you should be entitled also online. And the DSA introduced a new system of due diligence for the platforms. They need to assess the risks that they pose to society and develop proportionate mitigation measures. There are several of these risks that are covered by the DSA, illegal content, for example, disinformation and the impact that this has to, for example, elections and political life, but also our health. Think about all the disinformation that took place during the COVID pandemic. But among the several aspects covered by the DSA, included in the text of the DSA, there is also any actual or foreseeable negative effect in relation to gender-based violence. So it's very important that gender-based violence is mentioned as one of these risks and taken into account, together with the protection of public health, the protection of minors, and in general, all those serious consequences to a person's physical and mental well-being. I think this is a very groundbreaking regulation. It's a global first, and I hope it will become the new golden standard at the EU level, but maybe also at the international level, because I think that it is really a new, refreshing approach to the responsibility of the platforms when it comes to the social responsibility of the platforms and the protection of users. In 2024, very recently, as you all know, because we had a wonderful presentation by Maria Mollica on this, we had a political agreement reached between the European Parliament and the Council on the Commission's proposal for a directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence. She already explained this. The directive criminalizes the most widespread forms of cyber violence, including non-consensual sharing of intimate images, including deepfakes, cyber stalking, cyber harassment, misogynist hate speech, and cyber flashing. This criminalization will, in particular, help victims of these forms of cyber violence in those member states that did not yet criminalize these acts. And one of the keys to combat cyber violence, of course, is digital literacy. And this is why the new directive also requires measures to develop skills that enable users to identify and address cyber violence and seek support and prevent its perpetration. I know that there was a bittersweet feeling about this directive, and there are shortcomings that are very important. I don't think we should celebrate this as 100% success, but from the point of view of cyber violence, I must say that this is this is incredible and groundbreaking. And also, as also Maria said in her presentation yesterday, the Digital Services Act and this directive on violence against women and domestic violence, they work in synergy because, as you might know, Digital Services Act does not define what is illegal. What is illegal is defined in the member state and EU legislative system. And of course, having this directive that makes Eurocrimes for forms of cyber violence allows this to also be taken into account in the Digital Services Act. So this is very interesting, very promising. We cannot wait for the directive to finally be implemented by member states in their own national systems. And then when it comes to policies, the European Commission has established a range of policy objectives and actions that aim to make progress towards tackling gender-based violence or protecting citizens from cybercrime. And these include, among others, the gender equality strategy, the strategy on victims' rights, the strategy for a more effective fight against child sexual abuse, the cybersecurity strategy, the strategy on combating trafficking in human beings. And more or less, these touch upon the issue of gender-based cyber violence from different perspectives. The European Parliament has also been working on cyber violence against women and girls. We have the LIBE and FEM committees. They developed a legislative own initiative report on combating gender-based cyber violence. There are some agencies that are very active, like IGE, like FRA, and especially FRA and IGE now have a key role in collecting data on violence against women across the EU together with Eurostat. I would like now to move to the member state level, because this is a little bit messy, to be honest, because of course, when it comes to definitions, the definitions tend to be gender neutral. There is this understanding that, of course, these forms of cyber violence can potentially affect victims of all genders. They vary considerably across member states. There is a considerable amount of overlap and disjoint. What do I mean by that? That we have sometimes different forms defined in the same way, or same forms defined or called with different terminology. And this is why I said that this is a little bit messy. When it comes to legislations, with very few exceptions, the great majority of member states do not have specific provisions on cyber violence. To this date, only Romania has a legislation that defines cyber violence. Some other member states, including Cyprus, Greece, Italy, Slovenia, they have adopted specific laws to target forms of cyber violence. They have specific laws on cyberbullying, on cyber harassment, on cyber stalking. More often, the use of ICT means is considered as an aggravating circumstance. This happens also in France, in Hungary, in Italy, in Luxembourg, in Portugal, in Spain. Sometimes you have this feeling that defamation, which is very relevant to cyber violence, defamation is aggravated if the offense is committed in front of a large audience, like, for example, in Hungary. And we can definitely say that the internet is a large audience. But in most countries, it's general offenses like threats, like stalking, that apply to both digital and physical forms of violence. And what the jurisprudence has done is basically contributed to extending the scope of traditional crimes also to incidents that occur online. And of course, when this happens, no specific reference is made to women, and these provisions are often gender neutral. When it comes to policies, these are also gender neutral, and very often age is taken into account more than gender. We have several policy actions that are oriented towards children and young people. And also cyber violence is often mentioned in the context of policies on domestic violence. It is acknowledged that technology-facilitated domestic abuse includes a range of controlling and coercive behaviors, as we've seen in other presentations before, threatening phone calls, cyber stalking, location tracking via smartphones, harassment on social media sites, the dissemination of intimate images of former partners without their consent. I would like to move to the third part of my presentation on the definitions and why definitions are so important and why we have to strive towards agreeing on common definitions at the EU level. And this is where, in the past couple of years, it, the European Institute for Gender Equality, has been working on this new digital dimension of gender-based violence with the objective of increasing member state knowledge and related policy effectiveness, and increasing our capacity to defining these forms. I engage in the process of establishing these new definitions for statistical purposes, with the final aim of harmonizing definitions across the EU. Of course, this hasn't been easy because there are challenges everywhere you look. And for example, the first important challenge is conceptualization. And this is something that I mentioned before. We need to confront this perception of the internet as an alternative and disembodied virtual environment. I think this is fading, has been fading in the last couple of years, but we need to explore cyber violence along a physical, psychological continuum of gender-based violence. We have to problematize it as another form of abuse embedded within the existing gender power structures, whose tangible consequences are often ignored. The second one, there are challenges related to existing definitions. When we have definitions, we have a great variety of legal and statistical definitions across member states, and this makes the selection of common components difficult because often definitions overlap or general offenses apply. And again, as I said, very often these forms lack a gender component, and this makes it impossible to collect data of the number of offenses committed on the ground of gender. And of course, if we don't have definitions, it will be difficult to collect data. Underreporting also contributes to a lack of comprehensive and comparable data. Victims do not always believe that their cases will be taken seriously by law enforcement, they will be helped, and they decide not to report. But also in anonymous surveys, we've seen that respondents may not be aware that their experiences online can be considered as cyber violence. And as a result, they do not report the abuse, which makes the data scarce and partial. And then, of course, data disaggregation. In several member states, data is not disaggregated by sex and the age of the victim and the perpetrator. The relationship between the victim and the perpetrator is not recorded. And when it is recorded, it is often in the context of surveys with a limited sample. ICT means are not always included, and as a result, we cannot specify whether the offense was committed through ICT, and then the cyber aspect is not identifiable in the data. No recording of the age of the victim occurs. And of course, this prevents also from collecting meaningful data on those forms of online violence targeting more young people, like cyberbullying, image-based sexual abuse, or elderly women, like, for example, identity theft. In the context of the study, we focused on selected forms of cyber violence against women and girls, and we provided new and gender-based definitions for the following. We have an umbrella definition for cyber violence against women and girls, and also some definitions for some of the most common forms of cyber violence, which include cyber stalking, cyber harassment, cyberbullying, online gender-based hate speech, and image-based sexual abuse. How did we develop these definitions? Through an in-depth analysis of the key components at the EU international and national level in order to address the challenges that I've just mentioned. The definitions are available in the report that we published, and I will give you the references afterwards. However, I would like to share with you some of the common components that we identified. So we can say that, first thing first, we know that cyberviolence includes a range of different forms of violence. So we recognize the multifacetedness, but that there are four key common components to all definitions. The first one, it is perpetrated by some ICT means, information and communication technology means, that is committed on the grounds of gender, or because of a combination of gender and other factors that might include race, age, disability, sexuality, profession, personal beliefs. That it can start online and continue offline or vice versa. So this is the component highlighting the continuum of violence, and can be perpetrated by a person known or unknown to the victim. As I said, more comprehensive info in the publication report and in the fact sheet, kind of summarizing the content of the report. These are available in open source on IGE's website. If you Google IGE or IGE cyberviolence, you will find it quite easily. So my conclusions, or to begin, because as I said, I think that this is just the beginning of our work. We've seen how cyberviolence is gendered and intersectional. We want to define it as a phenomenon that is based on in which women and girls are hated, discriminated, and abused because they're women and girls. And that is also intersectional, that of course, the lived experience of the internet varies considerably according not only to your gender, but your identity in general. That the legal instruments are general and unharmonized, especially at member state level, but there are some very important advancements at EU level, like the Directive on Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, and in turn also the Digital Services Act. The data collection is limited and unsystematic. This is sometimes a little bit an argument that we face to say that we cannot develop effective policies because we don't have enough data. I don't want to fall into this pitfall because this is very dangerous. We have enough data to develop policies. Sometimes it's a lack of political will, but certainly we would benefit from more disaggregated, comparable data and from the development of indicators that can be populated at member state level. And fourth, of course, this is all connected, right? Because if we don't have definitions, we don't have legal instruments. If we don't have legal instruments, we don't have data collection. And the definitions lack harmonization and alignment. And this is why I decided to propose harmonizing them. My final word for today is that I hope that my presentation has shared with you that what is measured becomes visible when it comes to gender-based violence, and what is visible can be monitored, and only what is monitored gets improved. This is why it's so important also to keep cyber violence and gender-based violence very high on our research agenda. Thank you very much, and I'm ready to answer to any question you might have.